I want to ask you a few questions about the quiz and the weekly assignment. And it's only fair to allow you to ask me some questions about those two things. But first of all, I want to frame it in the larger context of the course. The first noticeable difference between this course and others is that we are doing history backwards. And why are we doing it backwards? Well, it's to be very clear right from the start and at every point throughout the course that history is rewritten by every generation according to its current needs and values and challenges. That does not mean that the historical record changes, but the interpretation of the historical record changes. Now, having said that, every week there's something in the news about a new archaeological discovery that turns on its head the historical record. So does the historical record change? Yes, but through the scientific process of discovery, not through the reinterpretive. Every generation reinterprets the historical record, so that changes. But the historical record itself thickens. It thickens every day. And so we are constantly also, for that reason, to have to reevaluate what's going on. And if we do it from perspective of the present explicitly, then we also have the benefit that we talked about last time of not pretending that history is an escape from the present. I love Downton Abbey. I love just disappearing in this incredible world that is disconnected from all of this stuff every day. But in the end, it all comes back to the challenges we face. And that's actually a healthier way to deal with history. The second thing you'll notice is by choosing to start from today, last week, before it snowed, we picked some sites. There were 4 sites, and they weren't the usual suspects. So what's going on with that? How are we choosing these sites? Well, we are taking a George Costanza approach to architectural history. You know George Costanza. Did we talk about George Costanza? So the kampong in Jakarta is not usually part of architectural history. And this week there's going to be another oddball that just is not usually part of it. And it's a challenge to teach this material because it's not been taught this way. And so that's one of the things we're doing. And the benefit, and this is the reason why we do the George Costanza approach, is if we presume that architecture is important because it's architecture, then we just look at buildings assuming that they're important, or because the teacher said they were important. And we run the risk of missing out on the benefit of sincerely asking, why this building, not that building? And by taking an approach to architecture history that starts with history first and foremost, and then asks the question, what does architecture have to do with it? What architecture played a role in these important historic forces? We then have the opportunity to discover the real reason the architecture is important and how it plays an important role. And the how part gets us back to the MIT example, where we looked at Nelson Goodman's 4 ways that buildings mean. And if I have my way, we're going to continue to refer to those 4 ways. The denotation, it's written, either on the building or in other mediated references. It refers to other things as a metaphor. It reproduces those other things. It associates with them. It reproduces things and changes them slightly. And so we'll see that throughout the examples. Our favorite one is exemplification. That architecture does what it does by structuring our relationships. This is the biggest one for us. This is the most difficult one. Some of us believe that this is the most profound thing that architecture does because it does it behind the scenes, almost invisibly, such as the structure of the lecture hall. We take it for granted, and thus its power. And the example in Medellin showed us what you can do in a positive way to give people dignity by giving them architecture, by giving them facilities that can demonstrate the seriousness of the commitment to social transformation. And so it exemplifies dignity. It changes the facts on the ground, to use Ariel Sharon's famous statement about warfare. You want to change the facts on the ground so that your opponent has to deal with the new facts. And you don't want the facts to be changed on you. And so architecture has the power to change the facts on the ground. And so that's the big one, which brings us, and then there's history happens. Architecture and sites host events that are beyond their control. No clearer example than this. So this brings us to the weekly assignment, which is a weekly exercise in you using some example to pull out how architecture operates through exemplification. How does architecture change the facts on the ground? How does architecture establish relationships that then forevermore go without saying? Relationships between rich and poor, relationships between powerful and disempowered, relationships between trade and culture. Within every site, there is a set of relationships that is structured by the formal spatial arrangements of architecture. And you'll notice when I say the word architecture, I mean the capital A architecture of Minoru Yamasaki's World Trade Center Twin Towers, but I'm also talking about architecture small a, which is what we used to talk about. That's what architects used to do. They used to design and understand large built environments and landscapes. That's the architecture we're talking about in this course. We're expanding the boundaries of architecture. We're we're eliminating the boundaries of architecture. Anything that lends itself to architectural methods of analysis, we're calling architecture. So physical, cultural, material reality, which brings us to the first thing I said to you last week, which was I am number 4. The teacher is not number 1. The teacher is not the source of all information. You are not empty vessels to be filled with my information. I am number 4. Well, what's number 1, if I can ask, Professor? Yes, you may ask. What's number 1? Number 1 is the world. The world is the teacher, the physical reality of the world. And so the formal spatial arrangements that the world presents us with is the teacher. And we are all learning through the methods of architectural analysis how to read and understand and cope with the world as it's presented to us. And there's some urgency to this task, in case you haven't noticed. But that's another reason why we started with the present, because the challenges of your generation, the challenges of the 21st century, must inform the lessons we learn from the world and from history. And one of the things we might find interesting in this course is how far back can we go? And we're going all the way back. How far back can we go before there's a disconnect between our current concerns and what the Egyptians were facing? And so I'm just floating that question. We don't know. It'll be interesting to find out. In that context, every week we are going to do this exercise where you pick a chunk of the world, the teacher, you do your best to analyze it, figure out what are the elements, what are the relationships between the elements, and how does that structure relationships that then go without saying. And so that's the important work we'll do every week. in the weekly assignments. That's the basis of the discussions you will be having with your teaching assistants in section meetings. That also happens to be more or less the structure of the written response to the quiz questions. That also happens to be the same question, same basic question that you should be asking yourself at least 4 times in every lecture. And it's the same structure as the quiz question. Use the example of the fill in the blank to demonstrate how specific aspects of that site play a role in blank. And so the whole course is structured as a pairing of sites and systems. We look at history and we say, what are the important forces operating at different moments in history? Do those forces come together in a pattern worthy of being identified as a system, such as slavery was an international system, or colonialism in all of its multiple forms constitutes in the world a system. So what is the relationship between the operation of these large historically important systems and the specific sites through which they operate? So what is the role of architecture in the operation of these large historically significant systems? And that's what we do in the weekly assignment, that's what we do on the quiz question, and that's what we do at least 4 times every lecture. And so it wouldn't be crazy to interrupt the lecture and say, excuse me, Professor, are you saying that this system of fill in the blank is operating through this site, fill in the blank, in these ways? And just as in the quiz questions and in the weekly assignment and in lecture, we play by Missouri rules. But maybe we'll leave that for later. I will show you what I mean by Missouri rules because that's easier than telling you. So if I get to the last topic and I haven't said, here's what I mean by Missouri rules, please wave your hand at me, okay? So within that context, let's start with the quiz. Does the quiz make sense? It says what specific aspects. So the ideal response would have you not say in general the King of Spain Library Park, but more specifically say the open space created in the foreground, in front of the library park, creates a social space, or as we saw in email, serves as the living room for the community, thus supporting a sense of ownership, a sense of occupation, and sense of place for life to take place in the community. So that's an example of an appropriate response in which a specific aspect of the site is used as a demonstration of how this larger social force operates. So it's not easy, but we're going to do it so many times that it will become second nature, hopefully. Questions about that? Yes?
So I'm still confused because I feel like open space and informality, it could just be a horrible situation where now this is the site where the gangs can take like what are the community members going to do to prevent like how is that still prevent gang violence having open space?
Excellent question. I had the same problem. So I told my teenage kids, pack up, we're going, and we moved to Columbia to figure that out. So I'm sorry the class is so short, but it's a survey. But I spent 4 months living there at great duress to my teenage children to delve more deeply into that. The short answer is the project did not just drop out of the sky and land in the neighborhood. They actually engaged in participatory design exercises to make sure that the local community felt a sense of ownership. They said, no, 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 we want an auditorium. We need a place for meetings. And so the city said, okay, okay. The architect said, okay, how about this? And they said, bigger. He said, how about this? So they were the clients. So it's not automatic. And that's exactly the question. It's not automatic. The reason the spaces are not taken over by the gangs is because the community will not allow it. And they have the support of police and city employees. These sites are swarming with uniformed, not policemen, but municipal employees to make sure everything runs normally. The architecture is not a solution all by itself. The architecture is a vehicle that creates a very convincing demonstration of the seriousness of the government to fix the problems. So that's not something we went into because we had 20 minutes. And that's going to be the case all semester long. It's a survey class. A conventional survey class is you cover 246 buildings and you need to memorize the names and dates of each one. We're backing off from that. We're doing 96 buildings, but it's still crazy, the amount of material we're trying to cover in such a short time. So I apologize, but we're going to get breadth rather than depth. Hopefully the depth can come in your own personal investigations every week. If there should be at least one question that you identify as being curious, like if you're skeptical about it, that's your weekly assignment. Dig into it, figure it out, report back to us. Okay? Because I didn't spend 4 months living in every one of these sites. Well, this one, yes, 6 years. But there are a lot of sites I've never been to. A lot of them are gone. So I'm not always going to have as deep an answer for you. So that's the work that we are doing. We're not studying history. That's too passive. We can't afford to do that. We got some serious problems. Instead of studying history, we are doing history. It requires your investment and your engagement as a doer, not just a regurgitator or a replicant of what I have to say. Other questions? So that's the quiz. We're going to do something like this every class meeting. It's part of your grade, very, very small part of your grade, but hopefully it gets the brain working as we move into class and the lecture, and it gives you that little incentive to keep up with the course. So most of this course happens with a steady outflow of energy and time commitment, and then there's a few spurts of energy with the term project and the 2 exams. But hopefully it's designed to complement the energy exertions of your other courses. And if it's too much work, if it's not timed right, write me an email, talk to me after class. I'm here to make this work for all of us. Okay? So the weekly assignments, there's probably a very uneven, or I can already say, if we looked at the Prezi, what we would see is some students appear to have been doing this their whole lives. They just do it. I don't know how you guys know how to do this, but it's fantastic. Others, not so much. It's important to partner with other people in your section who know how to do a screen capture, who know how to work with images. So now that we're into it, what are your questions and challenges with the weekly assignment? So, yes.
This is more of a comment, but the program that you recommended for Windows, Jing, for some reason when I do a video of that, it creates a file that's not supported by YouTube, or Prezi, or Windows Media Player.
Do you hear that? Jing produces a file that's not supported by Prezi or what we need. How do you overcome that?
Did you export
I tried exporting it and then it cropped it and cut the video. So I just use a new program.
What's your name?
June.
Who can help June? And I'm looking for number 3. You're number 3. TAs and I, we're number 4. Are there any number 3s?
I mean, I just like downloaded the program.
A new one? Well, if there's no number 3 that steps forward to help you out with that, if someone who knows how to do this using a PC, then your teaching assistant is the next line of defense. Okay? Other questions? Yes?
Tutorial on how to use,
We have a tutorial on how to do videos.
like just the, not like how to do like actually like the technical way to get the video.
How to get a video to record properly. Screen capture. Is there a tutorial? I'm going to throw that to you guys. You could make one, or you could find one on YouTube. I saw The Matrix, and I really thought it was cool how they could just learn all kinds of stuff really quickly online. And so I like to do that. I look in YouTube, and there seems to be lots of people eager to teach us how to do everything we need to do. But maybe our TAs can curate 1 or 2 and tailor them to the needs of students. So talk to the TAs. Maybe what we should do is, if you're looking for technical support, let's gather in the corner after class. Office hours. My office hours today will be right after class. You have a class after class? So meet with us after class, just enough to arrange another time. And that goes for everybody. Okay? But we'll get you through this. We have brilliant, lovely TAs who will step up. We're here for you. We're your support team. Okay. So how's that? We'll meet after class for any of that technical stuff. So any other questions in general or specific? Yes?
So, I sent the email about the due Wednesday mornings, or those will be due Wednesday 9 a.m.
The due date, the deadline of Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. Help me with this. I'm trying to think like a student. If the Wednesday group, the section that meets on Wednesdays, if their deadline is at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, and the Friday group, both Friday groups, if their deadline is 9 a.m. on Friday, is that okay? Well, there's a problem that, you have the last lecture, and then the Wednesday group has a day to deal with that material, and then it's due. What if we did this? The Wednesday group tackles the material of the Wednesday and the Monday lecture, and the Friday group tackles the material of the Monday and Wednesday lecture. Can you think of a problem? There's going to be some messy, there's going to be a week like next week when you're going to be dealing with today's content, Tuesday's content, Wednesday's content, and then you're basically going to have 12 topics to choose from. With 3 lectures worth of topics to choose one from and do your analysis. The Wednesday group will have 8 topics, 2 lectures content to choose from. But you're still just doing one topic. You're identifying something to look at, and you're doing it, one thing, for both groups. You're just choosing from a different pool. If you can think of any reason why that would cause an unexpected problem, say so now or email me when you think of it. You guys can think of what's going to go wrong that I'm not thinking. Because unintended consequences is something historians increasingly have to deal with all the time. Okay, so now to the meat. We have 4 sites to cover in an extremely short period of time. And those 4 sites cover a huge area of topics. So I'm going to do my best. The World Trade Center Tower relates to some of the things we've already looked at. First and foremost, it relates to the Burj Khalifa, because the World Trade Center Twin Towers were the tallest building in the world for a long time. They were built at great expense. It took decades to do it, unlike the Burj Khalifa, which went up in breakneck speed, record time. The World Trade Center Twin Towers went up on an area of Manhattan that was bulldozed as part of an urban renewal approach. Urban renewal was a post-war strategy for transforming the cities through mass demolition. It was one of the first towers to solve the elevator problem by replicating the express and local pattern of the New York City rapid transit system, the subway system, which has express trains stopping every 4 or 5 stops on one track and a local train that stops at every stop. And so by doing that, they solved the problem of reduced returns on investment from the elevators. Later projects have done that also by increasing the speed of elevators by miraculously controlling the acceleration so that it's just below the acceleration rate at which we get sick. The other physiology problem of tall buildings is it turns out that we can go like this, and we can go like this, and we're fine. But if we go like this, oh, make him stop, I'm feeling sick. So that was another physiology thing that these buildings had to deal with, is to limit the swaying to one direction or another and never permit it to go in a circle. There are huge counterweights. There were huge counterweights on the roof driven by hydraulic pistons that would accelerate the counterweights in one direction or another to counter the swaying of the building. By doing this with the elevators, they were able to open up the ground floor into this spacious experience. Yamasaki was influenced by the Gothic, and he was also afraid of heights. So he put the structure on the outside, which of course you know, those of you who've taken physics, which is everyone, right? You know that the moment of inertia, you take the radius is to the 3rd power, so any material you put on the outer web of a structure is much more valuable in terms of structural integrity, just from that formula of modulus of the inertia, moment of inertia formula. And so those things come together to create this outside skin structure where the windows on the upper floors are limited to 18 inches wide, which was also done to prevent people from getting a sense of vertigo, another physiological human experience response to the architecture. So this was Lower Manhattan prior to the project. It was conceived in the late 50s, early 60s. The commission was given to Minoru Yamasaki in the 60s, and he debated multiple different configurations, which all came out of the tradition of high-rise architectural design of the mid-20th century, which is something we will be covering in the prequel to this chapter next week. This part of Manhattan was demolished. You see the block and lot structure of Manhattan. Another thing we might cover in the future weeks as we move back. This is a super block. And the superblock was an invention of 20th century modern urbanism, which gave greater flexibility to large complexes. You see it here in Boston in the Prudential Center. And it wasn't just this superblock, but also the land reclamation in the Hudson River across the West Side Highway in a development called Battery Park City, which, and here we see the landfill, the former piers. Earth is moved in, as we saw in Dubai with the creation of the islands. Earth was moved in to create new parts of the city. And so here we see in the foreground this entire new extension of the urban fabric of Manhattan, and built out in the 1980s in a postmodern architectural style, where basically a stripped-down modernist building gets a more expressive form like a hat on top. Some of the explicit references, and here we get into Nelson Goodman's mode of meaning creation number 2, is Yamasaki is reproducing prior architectures with a difference. And so he's making reference to each of these and changing it and incorporating it and integrating it into his project. And so we are going to look at a few of those. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, one of the names on your sheet, is one of the grand masters of modern architecture. Phew, he's finally getting to the history of architecture that I recognize. He was a German who, one of his most beloved projects was this brick country house, where we see a very direct translation from abstract painting into the form of a building. And you see these floating planes that still perform the purposes of the functions of architecture because of the industrial technology of steel and glass. These technologies allow us to do more than simply punch holes in solid structural walls to create windows. This allows us to move structural loads. Again, here we're getting into physics. The steel in the roof allows us to transfer loads to these bearing walls in a way that allows us to leave entire stretches of the structure open with glass. And so moving quickly to where this intersects with Yamasaki is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe comes into this discussion primarily because he was one of the early experimenters of the implications of the glass and steel tower. And it was these two theoretical projects where he immediately saw a problem with glass and steel buildings. If you hate glass and steel buildings, the reason you hate glass and steel buildings is probably because of their tendency to appear absolutely rock solid. It's like a giant rock that is opaque when the light is reflecting off of it. And it's that reflective nature that many find extremely objectionable in these glass and steel towers. Well, right from the get-go, 1926, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe is saying, this is a problem. And how do we address it? We curve the glass. And the reason he's curving the glass is to control the reflections, to maintain the experience of transparency. And this is a tangent. The whole issue of transparency is a profound issue worthy of further exploration in your electives offerings that deal with painting and architecture in this beautiful conversation that took place in the 20th century between architecture and fine arts. Another strategy incorporating plain sheets of glass, less effective because of the physics of the optics of glass. This will create reflective reflections, but because of the faceted nature, only one or another of these facets will be generating reflections at any given time. The rest will be appearing to be transparent. Now, these lessons of 1926 get forgotten by everyone, including Mies. In 1957, Seagram Tower, that he collaborates with Philip Johnson on, he goes flat. And there are two big reasons to think of this building. Since we're flying through this quickly, I'm just going to say it, that the ideological commitment to the honest expression of structural systems is at the core of the rationalist instinct of modern architecture. And so we get a very clear, expressive element on the facade of the Seagram Tower in these I-beam sections. But it turns out that it's decoration. It's very disappointing to understand that the fire codes of the day and still today require that all structural steel be encased in a fire protection, in this case concrete, and if it were actually carrying the loads of the building, it would have to be encased. And so you have the real steel here, and then you get the decorative steel there. So it's one of those paradoxes of modern expression. This is a famous detail from the Seagram building. And the other reason...
Notice the very heavy turnover, but notice also that a remarkable...
This is the other thing that makes the Seagram building famous, and it's the plaza in front of the Seagram building that became the focus of study by William Hollingsworth White in his 1980 The Social Life of Small Public Spaces, Small Urban Spaces, where he uses some techniques that are not so unrelated to what we're doing to study how the formal spatial arrangement of the plaza in front of Seagram Tower exemplifies a situation and it creates a condition that inspires a predictable and specific response to human occupants in terms of sunlight, in terms of social interaction. Another precedent is Rockefeller Center, and it's similar in that the buildings themselves are of great interest. Raymond Hood's 30 Rockefeller Center is a famous building. It's beautifully detailed with the Art Deco sculptures. But more than anything else, it's the public space that is framed by these buildings that has the most profound impact on cities throughout the world to this day. This is one of the most common points of reference for new designs throughout the world. It somehow miraculously guides us from Fifth Avenue down a gradual ramp using an idea from Beaux-Arts design of a very gradual, almost imperceptible, leading us down to a sunken plaza where the ice rink is. How many people have skated there? Great, so you know what I mean. And thus it seemed to make the world safe for sunken plazas. But it turns out that you have to be very careful how you do sunken plazas. The ordinance in New York City for giving extra floors to buildings that provide amenities such as sunken plazas turned out to be not quite specific enough, because the sunken plazas that were created in the 70s and 80s turned out to be horrible, wind-blown, desolate places devoid of life. So an example of a failed urban space. The Empire State Building is a precedent. The tradition of expressive tops is rejected by Yamasaki in favor of a pure modernist form. It joins with the sky. It was very strongly ideologically driven. During the construction, we see this statement. And again, we see this issue. There's the form of the building, which is the thing that seems to be most obvious, people pay attention to. It's the tallest, it's the biggest. But then there's the space between the buildings and the space on the ground that is powerfully influenced by the building itself. In this case, again, getting to the physics of the world, the wind blowing between the towers required ropes to be set up on the plaza in some conditions so that people would not get blown off their feet as they try to enter the building. It was very dramatic. One of the things that the Rockefeller, that the World Trade Center ushered in was the death of the steel industry in the United States. But wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. This building took enormous amounts of steel. Why would it lead to the death of the steel industry? Well, the granddaddy monopoly of all steel companies in North America was U.S. Steel, based in Bethlehem. Well, it's Bethlehem Steel, based in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And they innovated by controlling the entirety of the production cycle. So from the mines in Cuba to the railway companies to the storage facilities to the shipyards. And they are one of the big reasons that the U.S. and the Allied forces were victorious in World War II. It's because the miraculous production of steel and the products of machinery and warfare that came after. But the competition from smaller so-called micro steel plants and then the steel coming from Japan and Korea and now today to China, hopefully we'll get to China, it led to the closure, the bankruptcy and closure of steel plants. And in 1995, the Sands Casino took over the Bethlehem Steel Yards and reused it as a casino, hotel resort, planting the seed for our focus in Singapore. Still, the iconic skyline becomes important in Las Vegas, and it becomes important for reason number 4. Architecture has a way of hosting events in history that transcend their architectural intentions. Or is that completely true? Why was this the target? The 9/11 plotters were planning students in Hamburg. They had an awareness of design of space, and but it didn't take a planning student to figure out if you wanted to attack a symbol of power, this is a likely target. And so the exemplification of the Twin Towers, which was designed to inspire a specific reaction, namely this one. Ah, right? It was designed to create that moment in people who come upon it. And that feeling of, that experience of, oh, is followed by, wow, the US is a big deal. Wall Street is a big deal. And so the events of history are actually connected with that act of exemplification that was always the intention of Yamasaki. And then in the memorial and the aftermath, also very much a product of the 4 ways that buildings mean: denotation, reference to other things in the footprint of the buildings, the exemplification, the experience of water, silence, and light, and the commemoration of the events in history. Which brings us to our next topic. The overarching topic of this lecture is cartel urbanism, cartel architecture. We saw it, we got a taste of it in Bethlehem Steel story. This is the oddball topic. We get to the oil rig as architecture. And so, is the oil rig architecture? Well, does it lend itself to architectural examination as we're doing it in this course? My conclusion after digging into this is not so much. And so I'm not going to be emphasizing the oil rig itself as much as the infrastructures the implications of the infrastructure of the oil platform and other similar extractive architectures. And here's architecture with a small a. There is a large amount of human effort devoted to increasingly large-scale extractions, which ties in with the demographic explosion that we looked at last week. If not for these extractive efforts, these extraordinary means taken to accelerate the process of extraction, we would have overrun our capacity to survive without resource wars long ago. Do we have resource wars? All the time, every day. But they are cute compared to what would be the case if we hadn't done such an extraordinary job accelerating our capacity to extract the assets of the limited planet much faster than anyone ever expected. The reason the Deepwater Horizon attracts our interest is because, or so I thought, it would be so well documented. But unfortunately, all I get, like it's also true at the World Trade Center, all I get are balls of flame. And I'm not interested in balls of flame pictures. So this is the only ball of flame picture we're going to see of this. We only got one ball of flame with the Twin Towers. We only get one here. So the architecture of the drilling platform has evolved quickly and dramatically to the floating platform number 7, which is the type of the Deepwater Horizon. It was drilling at the time of the explosion in 2010. It was drilling in about a mile depth of water and went down another 30,000 feet, so for a total of something like 7 miles, making it arguably the tallest structure in the world, if you count from drill bit to top of the rig. It's really a remarkable, bold adventure to drill like that, and it gets replicated in a way that does transform the landscape, not just on land, as we see in this fracking map in North Dakota, but also of the planet's oceans. And so to an increasing extent, our ability to maintain the whole thing, to keep it going and keep it from collapsing, depends on this extraordinary effort to extract commodities out of the landscape. And it's a very intense process wherever it occurs, and it's also very extensive. It's both intensive and extensive, as you see in landscapes like this. Horizontal drilling technologies where you can send a drill bit down and then curve it to run it horizontally under other people's mineral rights is a physical trick that has legal and economic implications. So you don't have to own the mineral rights of a property. You can drill into it from several miles away and come at it from the side, which allows a much more focused concentration of extraction efforts, which quickly brings us to Africa. The forces of history, one of the biggest forces of history, and this is not new at all. This is one of the oldest games in town. Extraction. Some historians have classified all human societies throughout history as either inclusive or extractive. The inclusive societies tend to be agricultural, everybody's a producer, or the productive capacity of a society is distributed. It depends on many, many small players, and this is the geometry that Adam Smith preferred in his theorization of capitalism. When it comes to minerals and other valuable commodities that are at the key of keeping this whole thing running, from our phones to our jets and our cars, is the concentration of extractive efforts in the hands of very few owners. And so this, I'm afraid, is one of the more depressing aspects of human history, is that we repeatedly encounter these extractive strategies and these extractive endeavors that concentrate power, wealth in the hands of very few, while the vast majority of these societies not only do not gain benefits from this great wealth, but they're actually thrown into a reverse direction in terms of whatever human progress was made in some of these societies over the centuries. They get thrown back into these feudal social structures. And this has become an infamous aspect of especially Africa. We're going to talk about China shortly, but as much as China is transforming the world and Africa is not, that is going to change. And it turns out that the combination of Africa and China is really the biggest game in town for the next century. So the colonial partition of Africa into nation states was a disastrous handicap for the 20th century up to the present, and resulting in many people believe that the genocide of Rwanda and multiple other conflicts to a large extent emerged directly out of that structural condition of nation states that are composed of constantly or consistently warring factions of subnational identities. And so when you throw into that social mix commodities, discoveries of extreme high value, it just throws jet fuel onto the already smoldering fires of ethnic tensions. And so this concentration of wealth very quickly deteriorates socially, usually with not just the political, not just the commercial side, the economic side of extraction, but also the political side of extraction, to the point where many historians look at those two things together in a political economy analysis of these situations. And so it's not crazy to consider Bilbao, the Guggenheim Museum, as a candidate for talking about this larger system. That the titanium of the skin of the Bilbao Museum by Frank Gehry, 1999. By the way, the other place this story comes into play is in talking about Medellin. The mythology of Medellin, the one that I'm trying to correct, is that architecture saved the city. Nothing could be further from the truth. These social transformation programs of Mayor Sergio Fajardo saved the city. Architecture played an important role in convincing people that the government was serious about investing in schools and opportunity and law enforcement. And so architecture played a crucial role, but don't expect that building library parks in Mexico City will solve the drug problems there, or Honduras. It takes so much more than that. You might not be able to do it without the architecture. You might be able to do it better with architecture. But architecture is not responsible in and of itself for doing much of anything. Similarly, we talk about the Bilbao Effect, and we talk about it so much that cities throughout the world have decided, I know, let's build a museum, or let's build a flashy building by a famous architect, and people will swarm, our economic development will jump up. That is, just because it's wrong doesn't mean that it hasn't become a focus of city efforts all over the world, which it has, under the name of the Bilbao Effect. So that's the other reason this building is worth looking at. But right now we're just going to quickly look at what it takes to produce that titanium. My partner in much of this project is Patrick Hoya, graduate of the program here. he and I taught together about 7 years ago for several years, and we continue to collaborate. He, more than anyone else I know, is adamant that mining is very much at the core of architectural history. So some of these slides are from him, where he talks about how architecture doesn't just appear from nowhere, it comes from a hole in the ground. And the impact of something like the Twin Towers or Bilbao is felt all over the world in open pit mines, in the labor camps, in the broken families, in the dislocation of families, of whole communities, in the name of resource extraction. And so it's not crazy to see this as a larger system, which is what we're floating in this course, is that these architectures are connected to these larger systems, that there is an architecture of extraction that transforms the built environment, the natural environment, and ultimately the planet. The largest iron ore terminal in the world is in Australia, and it is supplying materials. The iron ore materials are going to China because of the booming steel production in China. Most of the steel in the world is now produced in China, which works as a segue to the third project of this lecture, which is over on the left there, the Marina Bay Sands Resort Hotel in Singapore. How many of us have been to Singapore? How many of us are from Singapore? No one's from Singapore. Okay, but been to Singapore. Singapore is amazing. What can I say? Any way you measure it, Singapore. Just amazing. Look at that. Remarkable. Architect Moshe Safdie from down the road here. Brilliant architect. One of the star-architects of the Bilbao Effect. He is called in to the city of Singapore to produce something that the world has never seen. Just like the Burj Khalifa, the World Trade Center, many of the projects we're going to see in China, the goal was to inspire those who come anywhere near this to go, oh. And there's something magical about making people feel that changes them. This is exemplification of the most raw primal type, where you simply, your breath is taken away. So I could list all the amazing firsts and largest and longest and most water, highest in the sky, but just take it all for granted that it's just the most expensive building ever per square foot. It is that. The most water, highest up in the sky. Some of the tricks of how they did it, so the cantilever alone was an extraordinary accomplishment. And then there's the sound and light show that goes with it, because like the Burj Khalifa with the fireworks that we saw, there is also this remarkable fountain light projection thing going on that, you know, what can I say? You look at enough of these and you start to, you know, what fun, first of all. But also, what a remarkable investment. And what are they thinking? What are the designers, what are the builders thinking? Well, they're thinking the same thing that they were thinking in the Burj Khalifa. They were thinking, how can we become the most, the biggest, we're not going to get the tallest building here, but let's get the coolest experience. It's not just to generate tourism dollars. And this is a question that will go into the China topic a few minutes from now. But here's the landfill, another, like Battery Park City, downtown Singapore, in order to expand, engages in a massive land reclamation effort. Dubai is bigger, but this is, I believe, a close second, where they're expanding the downtown area in this entire new extension of the city. Singapore does what we wish everyone did. They look at history. They look at who has faced this before and how did they face it. And did they do a good job? Where did they succeed and where did they fail? Why did they fail? What can we change to succeed where everyone else failed? This is the commitment of Singapore. This is what they do, and they do it better than anybody has ever done it. I'm going to be so bold as to say that. It is remarkable. And so they have one of the best transportation systems in the world, not because they have good trains, but because the trains and buses are integrated with the land use patterns of the new city. So when they extended the downtown area, the challenge was they already had all these subways. How do you extend that subway capacity downtown in the new extension of downtown without building whole new subway systems? Well, they do it by taking extraordinary measures of interconnected walkways that are cooled. And why? What is going on here? Going way back in history, Singapore was a British colony for the transfer of goods. This was the port, very dirty, but very effective. Moving very quickly, the British gave independence to Malaysia and Singapore, which was all part of the British colony of Malaysia, in 1963. And immediately there were ethnic tensions, like in Africa, between the native Malays, the Bumiputra, which is Malay for the children of the earth, the Bumiputra Malays, with a long history of indigenous occupation of this land, and the relative newcomers of the Chinese. The Chinese had only been there for 1,000 or 2,000 years, and so they were the newcomers. There's something about the ethnic divisions of this part of the world that does not allow those divisions to soften over the centuries, despite linguistics, despite intermarriage. And so violent riots occurred between the Malays and the Chinese. And Malaysia's response was, for the first time I can think of, certainly in modern history, a nation state of Malaysia said, you know what? We're done with you, Singapore. You are out. We are kicking you out of the country. So Malaysia did not seek its independence. It did not win its independence. Singapore was ejected from Malaysia, which made this man cry, because it was obvious that the plan was mass starvation and death, because Singapore was a tiny island off the coast of Malaysia. It couldn't even supply its own drinking water. It had no agriculture to speak of, had no resources. It was totally dependent on the mainland. The British had withdrawn their military forces, which was the dominant mode of employment. The city was filled with slums, one of the most densely populated places on the earth. A friend of mine traveled to Calcutta, which at that point was the most notorious place on earth in the 60s. And then he went from Calcutta to Singapore, and he said, take me back to Calcutta. Singapore is worse. So some lovely British buildings, and Lee Kuan Yew, the man crying on TV as he announced that Singapore had been basically left afloat on the iceberg to die. His British training, his technocratic attitude, his commitment, and his willingness to be a dictator led the People's Action Party to take control, and they went from the kind of density that you see above to the redistribution of land and dwellings that you see below. This is the the quick story of this is he took the ideas of 20th century modernism that we think of as being at best a partial success, but also responsible for giving us these horrible concrete highway parking lot ridden cities. In Singapore, he takes that formula from Le Corbusier and others of the international, what does SIAM stand for in English? Modern Architecture, the Congress of International Modern Architecture, something like that. I'm not going to say it in French. They took those ideas and they looked at what worked and didn't work. And so Singapore is the place that breaks the rules of our assumptions of history that modern urbanism was a disaster. They make it work, and it's actually quite wonderful. In the 70s, they aggressively relocate people. They bulldoze the overcrowded inner city. They move people out, and they put in buses, roads, and finally the heavy rail system. And they do it in a way that people can walk from where they live to the nearest subway stop. They give people these modern buildings that they are thrilled to be in. It is a transformation. It's a social transformation. We'll talk about this a couple times in this course. The issue of whether you can improve people's conditions by giving them better housing. And the conventional wisdom now is no, forget about the housing for many reasons that maybe we'll have time to get into in the future. But in Singapore, and typical of the Singaporeans, they prove that wrong. They put people in these houses and their lives are transformed for the better. And this is what the key issue in Singapore is. They create a social package. They create housing, public housing, that 87%, up until recently, 87% of the population live in public housing. They pay low rents. Their employers are forced to pay into their provident fund that they can't touch except for housing, but it's for retirement and college. They transform the waterfront with a new port, becomes one of the largest in the world. The series of projects, including they establish a national airline, Singapore Airlines. They blow the competition out of the water based on the character of the all-women flight crews. And set the standard for Dubai is still emulating with their national airlines this move by Singapore. They do a tremendous job with the urban fabric with these natural and man-made canopies. It's right smack dab on the equator. Nothing is hotter, but it's not bad walking around because they saved these elements. They did not fill their tower blocks with parking lots. They filled it with gardens and social space for collective gatherings. They created ethnic mixing and social mixing in their towers. They also give all kinds of tax incentives to live with or in the same building as your parents. So they try to keep families together. For a while, they gave you tax credit if you didn't have children. And then they switch that. They give you tax credit if you don't have children still, unless you have a college degree. And if you have a college degree, then please have children. So there's a very extreme social engineering. Why? Because they were going to die. They were going to collapse into nothing. This is the port. It's a great place to hang out at night. And the big hope of Singapore is that it shows what you can do if you take this stuff seriously and you take a critical approach to how you manage not just the physical fabric and not just the legal structures, but you take it all together and deal with these things and use the levers of power to really get a handle on things. Yes?
How did they afford to start these projects? Like when they were first going off, they had no like
This gets into the Cold War topic that we're going to get to soon, but they had a lot of aid from overseas, in part because there was competition to keep between the Soviet Union and the U.S. to keep these places from going communist. So that was one answer. That's just a quick answer. I'm not totally sure, but that's what I'm going to say for now. Which brings us to China. Finally, how many people have been to China? How many people are from China? Okay, just two. China, why did it take us so long to get to China? China is the punchline for everything. China is the biggest game in town. And it connects with Singapore in that many of us in the last century were hoping that these amazing things that Singapore was doing would actually become a template for what China could do, and that held the promise of leapfrogging the West. We've done some amazing things that we're going to talk about, and by we I mean the West. The United States, let me say the United States has done some amazing things, unprecedented in human history. And we're going to talk in future weeks about some of those things. And it's important to remember that no matter how negative our assessment gets, really the short story is that all of our problems in the 21st century, most of our problems in the 21st century, are a direct result of the astounding successes of the 20th century, the unintended consequences of all that success, that unprecedented, unexpected success of the 20th century. We thought that more success would solve those problems as they came up. It hasn't worked out so well that way. And so, but even as we dig into all these horrible things that we're faced with in the 21st century, mostly you, because I'll be dead, it's really a result of the unintended consequences of so much success. So the hope was that Singapore would form a template for China as things grow into the future. But it hasn't worked out that way, despite signs that China actually hired the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore to help them plan the expansion of the city of Suzhou outside of Shanghai. But it didn't really snowball the way we hoped. China has kind of taken a great leap forward approach to managing things, as we'll look at. So we're going to start with the Oriental Pearl in Shanghai. Again, one of these projects, hopefully we'll be moving beyond the wow factor. But here's another wow factor project. Clearly, the people who behind this project were saying, what can we do to make people say, wow? And all the economic development that grows from that, from inspiring that sense. And so there's a lot of wow factor. There's the elevator core. Here's the presence on the skyline. Sorry for going so fast. There were some more pictures. I'm not sure what happened to them. But this project of the Oriental Pearl was part of a larger project. And just the most iconic and symbolic piece of the larger project of finally crossing the Huangpu River. Here's the European settlement area of the Bund over here that came into prominence in the 19th century and peaked in the 1920s. We're going to talk about that later, later in the course. But there was a reluctance to start developing the other side of the river because it was so hard to get to. I mean, you could get there by ferry, there's a lot of rice fields. But China, at the death of Mao and the rise of Deng Xiaoping, they were facing a challenge. They decided they wanted to open the door to trade One of my greatest regrets is not going on the field trip in 1979, the first public school to ever go to China, and I've been trying to make up for it ever since. Similarly, China has been trying to make up for its humiliations in history ever since. It's time for China to take the stage, the demographic champion, the largest country in the world, 1.3 billion and counting. So what do? They hire star architects to design a new city, a Manhattan, a financial district on the far side of the Huangpo. And what do? They use Nelson Goodman's number 2. They take La Défense, and they said, what if we built La Défense? And so they tried that out in Paris. Then they said, what if we took this other part of Paris and we put it there? And there it is, standing in for the Oriental Pearl. Lots of Eiffel Tower stuff going on in China. Then what if we put Venice there? And so they're very directly in this competition testing out the power of reproducing something known with a change, with a difference. And so here is the range of entries by the star architects for Pudong in the 1993 competition. Who should win? Surprise, surprise, the local Shanghai Urban Planning Institute wins the competition. They take the ideas of the star architects, they incorporate it into their own design, and Pudong grows up around the Oriental Pearl using a lot of the elements they stole from the foreign star architects' entries, and through the invitation of world-famous firms like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Here, the historic Pagoda Tower is the source of the Jinmao Tower. Here, the circle was too reminiscent of the Japanese flag, and so they had to quickly scramble and change it at the last second. Then they followed up with multiple mega projects, including the Olympics in 2008, where we have the spectacular star architecture of the bird's nest, and then we have the human model, the extravaganza. The equivalent of the Burj Khalifa fireworks is the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics, and then a regular clip of other things. The next thing was the World Exposition in 2010, where one over-the-top architecture after another is paraded in these fairgrounds. This is one of my, I hate this example, but it's a very powerful example of denotation. The figure for human takes the form of the building itself, resulting in what I would imagine to be a horrible experience, but a powerful example of denotation in the spirit of Nelson Goodman's 4 principles. So the next big thing that happens is in 2012, China announces the next great leap forward, which is not necessarily a good thing given the history of the last great leap forward, the death and destruction in the wake of that. So the great leap forward of urbanization. They say, we are going to move, willingly or not, 250 million people from the countryside to cities. And we're going to do it in 12 to 15 years. So breakneck pace of construction, of dislocation. Despite all the building of luxury condo towers, this is a typical arrangement even before. Here's one visualization of the new city at Whitehorse. The village of Whitehorse is being transformed into this city. And this is replicated multiple times. The New York Times has a fantastic visualization that gives you kind of a gut sense of how many people, they compare how many cities, Paris, London, New York, you'd have to gather together to make up 250 million people. And so here's another way of looking at the rapid transformation. And here's another way. In 9 years' time, this is what happens to this farmland. The dislocation is extremely difficult. All throughout China, these negotiations are going on where the government official, without any real recourse, is negotiating with the people for their land. And this is what happens very quickly. And this BBC sponsored. And we're out of time.